You're listening to episode 5 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Fadel Zeidan speaks with us about the new research paper, Correlates of Mindfulness Meditation-Related Anxiety Relief. We've seen the results of self-report studies demonstrating the results of mindfulness on stress, depression, anxiety, and any number of other difficulties people have on a daily basis. But what's happening in the brain that corresponds to those results? What is it that's happening neurologically? Dr. Fadel Zeidan is a postdoctoral research fellow at Wake Forest School of Medicine. His research interests focus on determining brain mechanisms that mediate the relationship between self-regulatory processes and health. He is currently employing neuroimaging methodologies to investigate brain mechanisms, supporting the modulation of pain by mindfulness meditation and other cognitive techniques, and brain mechanisms associated with processing the relationship between expectations, beliefs, and executive-level cognitive processes on the subjective experience of pain. Other ongoing research projects include assessing brain regions involved in meditation-related anxiety relief and other health outcomes. And our guest today is Dr. Fadel Zeidan. Fadel, thanks for being on Present Moment.
Thanks for having me, Ted. Pleasure to be here.
It's good to speak with you again, old friend. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and some of the work that you've been doing before we dive into this particular study?
Sure. So my graduate school training is in experimental health psychology. I've been always fascinated by how our behaviors can promote health, how we can self-regulate certain health outcomes. Really particularly interested in the effects of mindfulness meditation on cognition, cardiovascular variables, anxiety, and right now my main focus is examining the effects of mindfulness on pain. And currently I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Wake Forest School of Medicine in the Department of Neurobiology and Anatomy. I'm a postdoc in Dr. Robert Coghill's Brain Mechanisms of Pain lab. So what I've been doing for the past couple of years is employing functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to assess the brain mechanisms associated with mindfulness-based health promotion and specifically pain relief. I really am interested in looking at what brain regions, what brain mechanisms are involved in mediating the relationship between mindfulness and health, and seeing what the interactions are between mind, brain, and health outcomes.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So the recent paper that just came out we're going to be talking about today, the title is Neural Correlates of Mindfulness Meditation-Related Anxiety Relief. And I'd also like to do a shout out for a moment to John McAfee, who is one of the co-authors on this that we've spoken with before. And John, we'll catch you on the next one. We will have you here. Nice to hear and see your name on this as well. Fadel, tell us about this particular article and what it's about and what you're intending to show.
Sure. We employed a same imaging study, essentially, as our previous paper published in Journal of Neuroscience, delineating the brain mechanisms supporting the modulation of pain by mindfulness meditation. So we had the same subjects, and it was essentially the same experiment, but we were interested in a different question. We were interested in assessing the neural correlates associated with relieving anxiety by mindfulness meditation. So essentially, we recruited participants without any previous meditation experience, and we trained them to practice mindfulness meditation across 4 separate days. And it was a very brief training. It's only 20 minutes a day. And we wanted to examine how state anxiety would change, if it would at all, with mindfulness meditation, and what the brain mechanisms involved in relieving anxiety by mindfulness. So in the first MRI session, this is before any training, participants came in and they were administered the state anxiety inventory. This is a very well validated measure of state anxiety. And we assessed state anxiety before and after the MRI scan. And then we assessed state anxiety before and after each meditation training session. And then they came back into the scanner for MRI session 2 after training. And we assessed state anxiety before and after the MRI session after training. And what we found was that anxiety did not go down in MRI session 1, but it went significantly down in every session that participants meditated. And interestingly, we found that the brain regions responsible for reducing anxiety are very consistent, remarkably consistent with the principles of mindfulness. So just a little bit of a background, general anxiety disorder or depressive disorders are associated with an inactivation, a deactivation of very higher order brain regions, the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex. These are areas associated with governing our ruminative thought processes, our self-narrative thought processes. So with patients, anxiety patients, you see an overwhelming deactivation in these areas. What we found, we used a correlation regression analysis. So it wasn't necessarily like a cause and effect relationship, but there is a relationship. We found that the greater the reports of anxiety during meditation, the greater the activation in specific areas of the brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, as well as sensory evaluative areas such as the somatosensory cortices. So this is kind of really much in line with being kind of in the present moment. There was an area of the brain, the right anterior insula, which is associated with interoceptive awareness, awareness of self. The more that activation in this area went up, the more that anxiety went down. So really what we found was that meditation reduced anxiety by increasing brain regions associated with governing the way that we process information, the way we process sensory events, by staying in the present moment, by not letting our ruminative thought processes elaborate and kind of dwell. Mindfulness reduces pain through this mechanism, which really makes just a lot of sense with what contemplative practitioners have been saying for thousands of years now. We just have the actual imaging data now to support those claims.
So, Fadel, you mentioned the right side, and I know that we have some bilateral symmetry activation in the brain as well as some one-sided activation depending on the various functions that are occurring. Tell us a little bit more about those different things that are happening.
So it's important to note that we found that bilateral activation of the anterior insula was associated with meditation-related anxiety relief. Now, the insula is associated with evaluating sensory processes. Okay, it could be from feelings that are innocuous, like touch, to nociceptive processes associated with processing pain. But what we found was that mindfulness meditation regulates emotions by stabilizing attentional processes, as well as enhancement of awareness of discursive sensory events. So the right anterior insula was associated with anxiety relief as well. And really important work from David Creswell, Norman Farb, Critchley, and colleagues has found that this area is very important in processing interoceptive awareness, awareness of self, feelings that are cultivated and interpreted by self. And so this is very much in line with mindfulness meditation, the cognitive state of mindfulness, being in the present moment, acknowledging sensory events as they arise, okay, and being able to kind of let them go with an emotion, a self-regulatory type of stance. And we've seen in our previous work, and again, mentioning other people's work, that this area is very highly activated during mindfulness meditation across many different types of traditions as well as training experience.
Yeah, in our recent conversation with David Black, we briefly talked about the different kinds of studies that are being done. And you mentioned David Creswell, and we'll also be speaking with him about some of his work, and we'll reach out to Farb and some of the others, is that the different things that are revealed, the different knowledges that we're finding, and the greater our understanding is in these individual studies, really build off of one another, that there's a great consistency between the findings, that as one study uses mindfulness meditation to look at this one particular event, as your previous work on pain modulation, for example, fits in so beautifully with the research of the other scientists who are examining what is it that's happening in the brain. Fadel, are there some aspects to this that you yourself are continually amazed by some of the consistencies that you're finding in the different research and what they're exploring?
Well, the most remarkable thing that I'm witnessing for the past, 10, 15 years of this whole mindfulness surge in scientific research is behaviorally how effective the technique is across so many different outcomes. I mean, without the imaging in itself, just whether it's depression, pain, anxiety, to PTSD, and other health-related types of outcomes, we see that mindfulness meditation, whether it's brief training or monastic lifestyles or monks, that meditation, this practice, is really beneficial to the way we process different sensory events through attention, as well as improving our overall well-being. And as to your point, Ted, what is really interesting as well is the consistency across neuroimaging studies on the neural mechanisms associated with promoting health through mindfulness-based practices. Specifically with our current paper that we're talking about, the anxiety relief paper, we see that, areas involved in sensory evaluation, like the somatosensory cortices, areas involved in higher order evaluation of self, like the anterior insula, as well as brain regions involved in cognitive control, as well as the ability to regulate our emotions, like the anterior cingulate cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, are all associated with reducing anxiety during a meditative state. Interestingly, we also found that deactivation of a specific area of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex during meditation was associated with anxiety relief. And this is one of the central nodes of the default mode of brain functioning, the self-narrative. This brain network's been related to mind-wandering processes, as well as some anxiety and depressive states. And what we find is that when people deactivate, the greater that they deactivate this brain region during meditation, the more that they report anxiety reductions, suggesting that they're able to stay in a present, focused type of mindset. They're able to focus on the changing sensations of the breath and acknowledge the different events that arise. What do I have to do later? A conversation that happened yesterday. Acknowledge that discursive event and simply to let it go without judgment and coming back to the breath. So the imaging data are painting a picture that's actually really interesting. It's surprising how consistent it is with being mindful across many different studies. And we just need to continue to paint a full picture of what's going on. We need more studies. We need larger sample sizes, and we need to engage and employ more robust control conditions to really disentangle some of the health-promoting components associated with mindfulness-based practices.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, Fadel. That's a good area that you and I have been involved in some discussions online recently about some of the constraints we have around sample sizes, and of course there are budgetary constraints with that. What would you like to see happen as in the near future and the far future to improve some of the veracity of these studies and the controls that are on them? What are some opportunities that you see we might have?
Well, I think it's really important to employ larger sample sizes so we can attain enough statistical power to really detect reliable differences either between groups or within groups associated with meditation. In addition, I really think it's important to employ robust control conditions. We really need to start disentangling some of the components associated with mindfulness. Is it facilitator attention? Are they associated with, simply believing that you're meditating? Is that enough to produce some of these effects? So employing some highly robust and active control conditions, which is starting to happen, it would be another important step. In addition, we need more funding.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
The NIH sequestration imposed by our Congress has really taken a dramatic effect on the scientific community. And what's interesting about mindfulness is that it's cost effective. It's essentially free to practice. It's not addictive, and the side effects are extremely minimal. So this is something that we should continue to fund as far as basic research goes, so we could actually gauge the efficacy of mindfulness-based interventions on a variety of health outcomes. And there's other caveats as well as associated with imaging meditation. For instance, we need to control for potential confounds associated with respiratory changes. I mean, even though we instruct our participants not to change the respiration rate, people actually slow down their breathing so they're able to focus on the somatic sensations, their breath sensations more effectively. And that can have some consequences as well on some of the imaging methodologies that we employ. And this is all just going to take a little bit of time to address. This is a brand new field. Neuroscience itself is a brand new field, and integrating meditation with neuroscience methodologies, it's a novel approach. So it's going to take a little bit of time to. What we really need to do is get a biomarker of meditation. So it's just going to take a little bit more time and research for us to properly identify the potential biobehavioral markers associated with mindfulness meditation as well as mindfulness-based practices.
Perfectly said. That's one of the challenges that we have with this and one of the pushbacks that often occur in these studies is everything you've mentioned. There are small sample sizes. Well, of course, there are financial constraints to that. It's, for many of the studies, self-report. Well, of course, there are financial constraints on that. Having someone fill out a form is relatively inexpensive compared to putting them into an fMRI and getting a scan of what's going on in their brain. You in particular brought up some very interesting topics of another criticism that often occurs on the papers is how do we know it's actually the mindfulness training versus attention? And we run into this as I think we very legitimately question how do we control for confirmation bias on the part of our researchers, and how do we control for placebo effects? And with a nod to our friend Dr. Kathy Kerr, placebo effects, there is stuff going on in the brain. It's not to discount that at all, and I want to make that very clear that something is happening. What we're talking about now is, okay, but what is it that's actually the cause of that? How do we identify that? Is it the intervention of attention, as we see perhaps with interventions that have nothing to do with mindfulness? Or is it really this practice, this intentionality in setting one's attentional spotlight on the present moment? Is that in itself what the causative condition is? And we're so early on that, we are having a hard time formulating some comparative controls.
We're going to get there.
And we're going to get there. I know David Cresswell is working on this as well. He's done some great research. And
sooner than later, too, Ted. There's some exciting research going on. And, we're going to disentangle these components. We're going to assess if, some of these effects we see with Buddhist monks, are these effects associated with them being unemployed their whole lives, living in a monastery, being offered food, being religious deities? Which is probably not the case. However, it's probably associated with some of these things. Living in the Himalayas your whole life can have a very beneficial effect on you and your well-being. So we have to also focus on how we translate the benefits associated with extensive practitioners, adept practitioners, to the everyday individual, especially in Western society. I published a paper in 2010 where I employed a sham mindfulness meditation intervention, where we led people to believe that they were practicing mindfulness when in reality they were just sitting with their eyes closed with a straight posture and taking a deep breath every 3 or 4 minutes, which someone could argue is a form of meditation in itself, but it's not mindfulness meditation. They weren't taught, to focus and to regulate of their emotions. So, and we did see some effects. We saw anxiety and tension went down in the sham mindfulness meditation group. But the genuine mindfulness meditation group improved significantly on cardiovascular variables and other psychological outcomes. So, and Richie Davidson's group's employing a very active relaxation intervention. People are comparing mindfulness to distraction types of conditions. So, we just got to start comparing some of the neural and behavioral mechanisms associated with the components that we think may also be at play here, whether it's relaxation, divided attention, a social support effect. Being in a group meditating can be beneficial just from you being in a group with somebody. That could be, So, and then obviously report biases and placebo-related responses. So we're going to get there. The research is needed to really illustrate, really demonstrate the efficacy of this technique, to really pinpoint some of the mechanisms of action of mindfulness meditation.
Yeah, and I think we'll see in the near future exactly what you're saying, Fadel, is that there will be control interventions that are standardized, that control for very particular effects like the social setting or the attentional component or other aspects of this that we're only just starting to learn about in this framework, in this context of scientific research. And what do we see when we do scan the brain, and which are the different networks that activate? And actually that's another topic we can speak about a little bit. It's not just one part of the brain that lights up and becomes more active when doing a particular mindfulness intervention. There are several different parts that are becoming more active, that it is a network, not just one spot. Are you seeing that same kind of result in your research?
Absolutely. In our meditation and pain and imaging paper in Journal of Neuroscience, our conclusion was that mindfulness meditation reduces pain through multiple mechanisms. So you have a mechanism that's associated with cognitive control, and that's associated with recruitment of a specific subset of brain regions. And then you have another mechanism of the ability to regulate your emotional responses to different sensory events, and that's associated with another subset of networks. And then there's that notion of positive mood. What if meditation reduces pain and reduces anxiety just by inducing a positive feeling, a positive mood? And some of our imaging data suggested that as well. And then there's the component of being mindful, being in the present moment. And that's associated, as we talked about, with the right anterior insula activation in the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. Being in the present moment, that's in itself is another mechanism. There could be another mechanism associated with placebo or reducing expectations of a future event. Okay, that in itself can reduce pain.
And anxiety, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so expectations play a role. Christopher Brown and colleagues in Manchester found that lowering expectations of an impending painful event predicted lower pain in meditators. So there are a number of things that could be going on. It's really important that we actually figure out what each individual is actually doing. Mindfulness, it encompasses a large umbrella. It can include vipassana practices, shamatha practices. So there's also going to be individual variability on how each person interprets the instructions associated with meditation.
Yeah, it's not as cut and dried as a science of measuring the rate of falling objects in a vacuum. You're pretty well set. You can control very much for that. But I will say, wonderful complexity of each individual's approach, even when given the same instruction, as you're saying, Fadel, makes this difficult to get standardized measurements because we are different. We do have that wonderful diversity in how we do even the same practice. But of course, that adds a level of complexity as we do studies. And what we're seeing in the brain, I'm glad that you identified these different sections of the different components of one simple mindfulness practice and how they may affect these different responses to pain or anticipation or deactivating the default mode network and putting us more into a prefrontal cortex zone of our brain. That we see lots of different things going on, not just one. And as we really narrow down and learn more about what the different regions are, what they do, and how they relate, we really see new opportunities opening up for therapeutic contexts of how we apply this in different issues that people are suffering from.
Absolutely. One of my overarching goals for the future is to take what I've learned from my imaging data from other people's research and start to specifically tailor mindfulness interventions to target specific outcomes. So I'd like to develop a mindfulness intervention that specifically targets pain, that specifically targets anxiety and depression. And this is what imaging data, this is what basic scientific research on mindfulness will lend to us. This is the contribution, is that we're going to be able to help people out.
So to find out more about Fadel's work, he is research fellow, Brain Mechanisms of Pain Laboratory at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. I am linking a page at wakehealth.edu that is on Fadel and his work. So please come to the episode page for this episode and you'll find it there. Fadel, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your time with us on Present Moment.
Ted, it's an absolute pleasure as always, and keep up the great work. We all appreciate it.
Today's quote is from Bob Stahl and Alessia Goldstein's book, A Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook. Together, your body and mind are a single dynamic organism that's constantly in a state of change, with interactions between stimuli from thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, sounds, sights, smells, and tastes. As you practice choiceless awareness, simply observe what's predominant or compelling in the mind and body and be present to it. If nothing is especially prevalent and you're unsure of where to place your attention, you can always go back to the breath, sensations, sounds, or thoughts and emotions as a way to anchor in the here and now. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.